I love the impression of the Pope that Jim Gaffigan does. Easy freak, I keep work at work. And I think I connected to that because I can't tell you how many times I've been in social settings and being a minister or pastor or clergy has come up, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, now religion is the only thing that we can talk about, now that we know what you do. And it's this really weird, like, then I end up receiving the confession of the unchurched about why they don't go, or they quit, or they can never go back, and how bad they've been hurt. And then, this is the most fascinating, then I have to absolve them of their guilt about a religion they don't really believe in, but somehow still has a stranglehold on their shame reflex anytime clergy are around. It's like, right? That's the only thing that matters. All of a sudden, like, you never hear them talk religion, but I'm sitting next to them, and all of a sudden, that's all we can talk about. So I would selfishly love to be able to just look at people and go, easy freak. I leave work at work. Why is talking religion, specifically talking about Jesus, so uncomfortable? Historical Jesus scholar and Christian writer Marcus Borg speaks of ours as a Christ-haunted culture. And he says this is due in large part to the high percentage of Americans who affirm or identify themselves as Christian. In some polls, and this is a couple years old, but in some polls, up to 80% identify as Christian, up to 84%, this is interesting, 80 identify as Christian, 84% affirm the statement, Jesus is the Son of God. Remarkable and seemingly way too high, since statistically significantly greater than the percentage who actually practice any form of Christian religion, less than half of that 80%. So people have a lot of beliefs that really have no bearing on their life at all. The point is, and we've learned this the hard way because of so many of these awkward conversations, Jesus matters to a whole lot of people, and apparently a lot of them have no idea why Jesus matters to them, but he matters. And yet, Christianity today has us never more divided in terms of what it means to follow Jesus. So I just want to set a baseline, if you weren't aware. The year is 2017. Now I'm talking about, this is not a flashback. It's 2017 now. This might be a movie, I'm not sure. Is there a ship going to Mars? Did we send people? Are they on the way? Are they thinking about that? They're thinking about it. All right, so we have the technology. We're not on the way yet. It's something we might do. We have a waterproof iPhone and the internet. Elon Musk is working on uploading his consciousness to a cloud or a machine of some kind. I want to set that baseline just to say this. Many, many, many followers of Jesus dismiss evolution for the literal, factual, 7-day creation stories, but many followers of Jesus were the first to integrate evolution into Christian theology by reading the creation stories symbolically rather than literally. Followers of Jesus are among the strongest supporters of our nation's invasion and continuing occupation of foreign countries in which we have political and financial interests. Followers of Jesus are among its strongest critics. Followers of Jesus are among the strongest opponents of gay marriage. Followers of Jesus are among its strongest allies and advocates. Followers of Jesus are among the strongest supporters of an economic and tax policy that benefits especially the wealthy and powerful. Followers of Jesus are among its most vocal critics on the biblical grounds that such policies betray God's passion for economic justice for the poor. Just a few sort of extremes to highlight the sharp disagreement among modern Christians regarding what it means to take Jesus seriously. And so I asked this question: does the difference between the message of Jesus and the message about Jesus have anything to do with our discomfort? Because I noticed that when it comes to the message of compared to the message about, you can actually pretty much trace these positions I've just mentioned down this line. Message about Jesus tends to be more conservative, lend itself to literal readings, okay with violence, concerned with power, marked by prejudice. Message of Jesus tends to be a little more progressive, metaphorical reading, nonviolent, empowering, egalitarian. And this makes sense, right, if you think about it, because message about Jesus, people tend to focus on Jesus as a means to an end. The answer to a question, the solution to a problem, a belief that has to be gotten right. Jesus as a transactional figure that does something in some supernatural, superstitious kind of way for those who believe the right thing. Meanwhile, message of Jesus people, which I think tend to be us for the most part in this room, emphasize the kingdom of God and its nearness. This is sort of the core message Jesus proclaims, as witnessed in things like justice, mercy, liberation, healing, shalom, peace, good works in the world, faith in the human capacity for goodness, not so much what we believe, but how we hold and practice whatever it is that we believe. It's more about living the way of Jesus than believing some supernatural transaction done by Jesus. And I think this distinction, which is named every single week in our community statement, is at the heart of our discomfort when we're uncomfortable talking about Jesus, but I also think it's at the heart of our energy and passion when we do want to talk about Jesus, because the message of Jesus is not for Christianity, but humanity. We say this every week. But we also have to admit that maybe the message about Jesus is for Christianity. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not here to hate on that. As a religion, that's okay. But maybe that's why it's so uncomfortable. Because it's an exclusively religious message that draws boundaries and excludes. You either agree or you don't agree. You either buy in or you don't. You're either a member or you're not a member. Like, the line is drawn, you choose which side you're on. Whereas the message of Jesus is an inclusive and human message that breaks down boundaries to invite and include all people. Now, Marcus Borg identifies these four sort of roles or identities that identify the historical Jesus: Jewish mystic, healer, wisdom teacher, social prophet. And I suspect that most of the time when we want to or somebody else wants to talk about Jesus, we might assume, likely from our own experience, that the topics will be one of those first three: mystic, healer, teacher. As a mystic, we tend to want to talk about Jesus and God, right? This is called theology, beliefs about how Jesus and God are connected, even though when we look at the historical Jesus, as a mystic, Jesus' spirituality informed his edgy life, his dangerous message of the kingdom of God, not abstract theology, but embodied, lived spirituality. As a healer, very often we tend to want to talk about Jesus and miracles, very supernatural, superstitious kind of stuff, even though, as a healer, Jesus' most profound and destabilizing work was actually social healing, restoring the unclean into religious communities, restoring the outcasts into belonging. As a wisdom teacher, we tend to want to talk about Jesus and ethics or Jesus and morals. What are the right things to do and what are the wrong things to do? Even though Jesus' unconventional wisdom was politically and religiously subversive, prophetic propaganda, this was not pithy chicken soup for the soul cliches, right? Because let's be honest, even these primary identities, we can soften the edge of the historical Jesus by making it a message about Jesus. But if we read the gospel seriously and listen for the message of Jesus, we can't ignore that there is a reality beyond theology and morality, beyond how is Jesus connected to God, beyond the ethics of what's maybe the right and wrong thing to do in any given social setting, beyond God and Jesus, beyond even great teachings like love your neighbor, do unto others. We have to admit that there is a reason this man got killed that made people so uncomfortable that they executed him. Right? You don't get executed for saying it's good to be good and it's nice to be nice. Right? You don't get executed for saying, I have a special connection with God. It's appealing to soften the subversive and edgy version of Jesus by talking Jesus and God or Jesus and healing or Jesus and ethics and morals, and we can force even those into a safe message about Jesus that actually lets us co-opt Jesus into whatever our own particular agenda is, sort of mash it into what we think. But much less often do we talk about Jesus and justice. Notice that's the one identity we haven't hit on yet, is Jesus the social prophet. In fact, in a summary, kind of similar to Marcus Borg's identities of Jesus, John Shelby Spong concludes the following about Jesus. These are his three primary identities: breaker of tribal boundaries, breaker of prejudices and stereotypes, breaker of religious boundaries. In short, Jesus and justice, or Jesus the social prophet. And part of me wonders if what's so uncomfortable talking Jesus isn't that it's been so domesticated, that these conversations are reduced to, do you believe something or don't you? Can you convince me or can't you? Do you buy into the message about Jesus or not? The problem is that at the end of the day, we're still talking about Jesus. Theology and morals, debatable matters. But what might it look like if we shifted the discourse and instead of talking about Jesus, we began to talk about what Jesus talked about? Just what several of you said during the dialogue, right? We get so caught up talking about Jesus, we actually forget to talk about the things that Jesus actually talked about. Unconditional love, belonging, the kingdom of God, the way of mercy, social justice. What kind of response might we get if we didn't lead with Jesus, but led with a conversation about a different way of being in the world? Right? Because if you look at what Jesus did, he didn't go around going, I'm Jesus, you should believe in me. It's going to matter when you die, trust me. No, he talked about a different way of being. That's the thing that was compelling. That's why we're still talking about him 2,000 years later. I feel like even the Pope would be willing to have a conversation after hours about this buoyant hope of a world made whole by the power of love and a gospel of peace and the work of justice and an ethics of mercy. Why did Jesus get killed? Not for having crazy theology, not for healing people, not for teaching that you should be good, right, for goodness sake, or whatever the Santa Claus Jesus is. Jesus was living, proclaiming and galvanizing a following around the language of the kingdom of God, which was a direct threat to the kingdom of Rome and a direct threat to the God gatekeepers of temple Judaism. Jesus got killed for being a social prophet who spoke truth to the power of his day, even though he knew what it would mean. Not for being a supernatural soul saver, but for being a flesh and blood pain in the ass. Right? That's why you get killed. A flesh and blood pain in the ass of a corrupt military superpower who was violently, financially, ideologically, and religiously oppressing the masses. And Jesus stood up and said, hey, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing that. Jesus got killed like so many before him, among whom he counts himself for being a prophet. Right? He calls himself a prophet multiple times throughout the gospel. So I don't think there's a much clearer example of the way that comedy is addressing really pressing issues about sort of the way our country is functioning. I love that it sort of threads the needle and makes fun of the ways that we assume that this is really partisan by including people from both parties and sort of poking fun at the system and just a brilliant piece. Thanks to Kate. She's going to share a little more at the very end of the service about how you can be a part of that if you want to. So in the reading, Jesus quoting Isaiah says that God has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners. This is a famous, well-known passage. Then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you, those of you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food, thirsty, and you gave me something to drink, a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, thirsty, gave you something to drink, that we saw you a stranger, naked, that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will tell them, truly I tell you, as you did these to any of the least of these who are members of my family, you did them to me. And I know what you may be thinking. How will we know what these felons believe about Jesus? Wow. Really, nothing. Just totally dead. Cool. This is what crashing in comedy feels like. The call to the way of Jesus, the life of Christ, the Christian faith, is a call to radical forgiveness and mercy, the love of enemies, social salvation, the restoration of human beings however and wherever possible. So tonight, we're going to set aside talking about Jesus and practice what Jesus was about. Not just like a convenient sermon where you get to leave believing something, but an invitation to do something that I think probably Jesus would be into. Restoring dignity, equality, a voice, social inclusion of people to the communities where they live. And look, I want to be really clear. If this is uncomfortable, if this is not your political conscience, that's fine. It's an invitation to have some dialogue, at the very least, about what we mean when we talk about forgiveness. Because that's really easy in theory, right? When somebody takes your food out of the fridge at work. When you're talking about the prison industrial complex, it gets a little bit more intricate. About loving people society has labeled enemies, about restoring human and social rights to folks who have made mistakes. Is it simple and easy and clear and obvious? No, or we would have this figured out, right? This wouldn't be a funny sort of prophetic comedy piece. This is messy and it's complicated, but it isn't an excuse not to do hard and risky work in the name of love, of the Christian faith, of a subversive way of living that scares some people and raises the defenses of establishments that thrive on the oppression of others. Now, the verb visiting in that Matthew 25 passage, visiting the prisoner, is more than just spending time with prisoners. It carries the connotation of showing practical care for those in jail and acting, if possible, to redeem them of their plight. And I think that's what this referendum is about. Not just care, but then what does it mean to redeem them? As in restore them into social inclusion, which again was a part of what Jesus meant by healing. Not just mercy, to care for somebody, but justice. To fully include someone again in the life of a society. And the most striking feature of the passage is the way Jesus identifies himself with those in prison, so that those who work for the humanity of prisoners actually encounter the anonymous presence of Christ. That's where God is met. See, when we move past the awkward and often fruitless conversations about what we believe about Jesus, and we begin to explore the things that Jesus was about, a clearer picture emerges. That Jesus is not just talking in Luke 4, for example, nor should the Christian tradition just be talking about a spiritual or a psychological liberation for those imprisoned by sin or guilt. He was also talking, and so should we be, about freeing people from the material structures and the ideological systems that rob them of dignity and freedom. Systems like the one being confronted in this very funny but incredibly serious clip, in this petition that we're invited to sign. So Jesus' entire ministry, not Jesus the magic spell who saves us from something when we die, but what Jesus was actually about, his entire ministry of feeding the hungry, of healing the sick, forgiving the guilty, embracing the outsider, loving the enemy, confronting the oppressor, was a fleshing out of this proclamation of the release of the captives. And part of the faithful engagement with prisoners and prisons has to include a commitment to the reintegration of released prisoners into communities of mercy and justice. Because concern for those behind bars has to be matched by generous hospitality towards them once they've served their sentence and face the struggle of re-entering a suspicious and often hostile culture. People often defend prisons as a means by which offenders can pay their debt to society, but the metaphor fails on a couple counts. Not only does society foot the bill for prisons, but ex-prisoners are never really free. They bear this unpayable debt of having a record. In the eyes of society, the record establishes that criminality almost is like an innate attribute, something of which they can never be free. What might it look like for felons and former prisoners to encounter a community of people who truly understand both the grace and the discipline of forgiveness? A community that loves its enemies, that welcomes strangers, a community that breaks down dividing walls of hostility and preaches liberation to captives. This is what Christ did. This is the invitation for those that claim to follow in his name. If we take Jesus seriously, as he takes seriously the consistent negative biblical valuation of prisons, it's crucial that we match whatever practical concern we have for those in jail with a vocal critique. This is the prophetic piece. A vocal critique of society's increasing reliance on prisons and the criminal justice system as a strategy for social control. Now, as we've said, this is risky, right? This is dangerous. This feels incredibly political because it is. Because Jesus was incredibly political. Again, this is the kind of stuff that got him executed, right? Not it's good to be good and it's nice to be nice, but we're participating in a system that's killing people. You get crucified for saying the system is failing us. It's killing us. It's hurting our brothers and sisters, and we can't stand by. And we sure as hell can't put a Jesus bumper sticker on a prison. It doesn't work that way. When Jesus has this supper with his friends, he breaks bread. He shares a cup. And he says, "This is my body. And here's my blood." It's broken and it's shed for this cause. As often as you do this, remember me. He's not saying remember the beliefs that you have about me. He's saying remember what I was about. Remember the life I lived. Remember the things that I thought were so important that I kept saying them even though I knew that it would lead to this, like it did with all the prophets that came before me. You challenge the system, they separate your body from your blood. That's how it ends. As we set this table tonight, we remember this Jesus. Not the awkward conversation topic Jesus, not the flashpoint of family theological arguments, not the anchor of moral shaming, but Jesus who called for the release of captives, no, really, the release of captives. We have to figure out what we mean by that. Jesus knew what he meant by it. He died for it. We have to figure out what we mean. If we claim to be following in the path and in the way and in the name of this Jesus, we have to figure out what it means for us to stand for the release of captives. And Jesus practiced that by opening his table to anyone and everyone. And so we try to practice in the same way. This table has been set for us tonight, open as always to us and to all people, felons, former prisoners, those who are guilty and haven't been caught yet, those who aren't guilty but live every day as if they were. This table is open to us and to all people. Come as you are. All are welcome. No one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.